Welcome to the episode 17 of the Office Hours podcast. Today we have with us Mo, as usual. And without further ado, we should start. I guess before we start, join Telegram and like, share, and subscribe this video. All right, let's go.
How you doing, Vasili?
I'm doing all right. You know, I finally had a chance to get a haircut, so that's good.
It looks good.
Yeah,
It
thank you.
looks good.
Thank you. I guess, now that if I have time to go and do a haircut, things are a little bit more relaxed, which is nice. We're kind of in refactoring stage at work, which is also nice because it doesn't happen too often where you actually get allocated time to do refactoring. It would I would say it's pretty rare. Most organizations like
Absolutely.
refactoring whatever, just features,
Yeah.
features, features. So, we have some time to fix all of the terrible, no good things that we had to do that, keep us awake at night. How about you, Mo?
I'm doing good. I'm doing good. Work is going well. It's a bit calm at the moment, but I can see it getting busy very soon because we have like some contract going on, and we have to, you know how these things go. Like
Mm,
you have the calm before the chaos.
yeah.
So yeah, we have the calm right now, but yeah, but it's okay. Life is good. Can't complain. We thank God. So today, what I want to talk to you about is actually pretty interesting. It's just something that has been on my mind for a while. It's about software security. But basically, I know it's a very broad term to say software security, but what I'm really curious about is in the process of software development, what are some techniques that you personally keep in mind um, to build like a secure software.
hmm Excellent
Aside from
question.
like
Yeah,
the aside from like the popular ones, like like the HTTPS or whatever, those kind of things.
right.
But what are some methods, like some things that you do personally to ensure that your software is secure?
Yeah, really great question. Really great question. And in fact, um, I have somebody from like the security world that would probably be interested in doing like a collab with us
Oh, that
and
would be
doing
nice.
like a
That would be
guest
nice.
guest session on a podcast. Yeah, it's funny. I guess I'll preface it a little bit. I guess I don't have it on right now, but in some of the previous episodes, I'm always wearing the hoodie from the B-Sides, which is a security conference, which is a pretty cool event. But every time I go there, I don't know anyone or almost no one, which is really weird because, you go to a security conference, you expect people
Mhm.
who do development are going to be there too because they should be interested. But weirdly enough, most people in security conferences are like security people and not too many developers around. And so it's anecdotal, but it kind of feels like there's very little cross pollination between these areas, but it's very important because breaches these days get pretty catastrophic. Somebody just exposes all of their customers' data accidentally, and it's like a massive scandal. Not a fun time for all involved. And that's from the development perspective, we definitely have to do a lot of things right to kind of not let that happen. And I think that the landscape right now, it's so much more difficult, excuse me, to deploy a more secure applications, mostly because, the way that they are hosted these days gotten way more complex. You have like all these different architectures, microservices, security tokens, they all communicate to one another. So if one gets compromised, you have the ability to compromise other ones. Or, sometimes people do silly things. There was like recently a big kind of a brouhaha where some companies were allowing like social media sign on, for instance, onto their websites. and they would not validate the ticket that they receive. So somebody created a malicious application. It wasn't like malicious in itself, but it was just allowing people to log in using Facebook, for instance, and then that application would take those credentials and try to log in into those other applications using the credential it was issued. And those applications didn't say, oh, the credential you're giving me wasn't actually issued for me. It was actually issued for that other app, and they would just like let you in. And so it was like, pretty
Yeah.
big oopsie there. So it's just there's so many things you have to keep in mind. I guess back in the day, the vulnerabilities weren't as sophisticated. Like the most sort of craziest things you'd have to look out for would be, injection vulnerabilities where you like don't sanitize your inputs from your users, and the famous Bobby Tables XKCD comic. I'm pretty sure a lot of people have read it at least once, if they work in security or if they just do development in general. In terms of the steps to take, I mean, well, there's a few. There's like automated scanning. You can scan your libraries for vulnerabilities. However, there's some problems with that because they tend to spit out a lot of false positives, or they tend to spit out vulnerabilities that aren't really applicable in your case. So I don't know. I develop for Node.js. So, there's the npm audit command, and you run it, and it tells you, oh, all of these packages they have these CVEs registered for them because there's like vulnerability, this and that. And at work, whenever we get a security audit or PCI compliance, the newest version of PCI compliance, which is the payment card industry. So it's like if you're doing credit card processing yourself, like if you're not deferring to like Stripe API or something similar, like if you actually if you process the credit card transactions yourself, you have to go through the PCI audit. And in version 4, they're basically saying like, oh, if you're using third-party libraries, none of them can have vulnerabilities. But the annoying part about it is that, I don't know, a lot of people use Webpack, for instance, to, compile and package their code. So if you run npm audit, it would say, oh, some dependency of the dependency of Webpack has this CVE registered against it, and you need to fix it. And then you sit there, it's like, but once I run Webpack, I just get an HTML and JavaScript bundle. That dependency has nothing to do with the code that actually runs in production. So like, why would I fix it? So things like that create this sort of, oh, npm audit spits out 3 pages worth of vulnerabilities, but we can't really do anything about it, so we're not going to care. So that's like on a static analysis side of things. In terms of being more proactive, there's like OWASP, the website that catalogs like the most common vulnerabilities. So you just have to be aware of these things. But unfortunately, the attacks are getting more and more and more sophisticated. So one of the recent ones, which kind of were interesting to me, is, like you have your application deployed somewhere in Kubernetes, and it's like fronted by some proxy server, and then it's fronted by some API gateway, and there's going to be like a chain of these nodes for like your request to the application travels through all of these different micro apps that pass it along from one another. And people figure out that different languages and different frameworks process HTTP headers differently. So if you construct your headers a certain way, you can pass some layers of defense in the first couple of layers, but then the parsing modifies the headers in a way that these artificial headers are being created later on down in the pipeline. It's called the header smuggling, and you can like affect how the target application behaves. And it's just like how the hell do you even figure that out? And so I think you constantly kind of have to be on your toes. But still, I think the most common thing that happens these days is just people accidentally committing their credentials to Git and pushing it to GitHub or something. It's just every time, like clockwork, somebody, connects the credentials, they store them in plain text, they don't follow like the 12-factor model. I guess right now 12-factor model is not even considered to be that good. Everybody's switching to secret managers like Vault or GSM or something like that, where
Yeah, of course.
you have this external service that maintains your secrets. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot of really silly ways of screwing it up, and people still do them. So you just have to kind of be educated, and you have to have security conscious people on your team to look at the code and say, oh, hey, this looks kind of dangerous. And I mean, the most basic things is like never trusting user input. I think a lot of the frameworks these days kind of have those assumptions built in. So, all of the unsafe HTML injection and like parsing user input. I'm a big proponent for data contracts on a boundary. So any inbound or outbound data is validated against the contract on both sides. This way, you can only send like well-formed data to your app. So yeah, well, there's just so many things.
Yeah, we're gonna unpack all of these things because, but first I want you to explain a little bit like you mentioned the auto auto scanning
Mhm.
with like the npm audit, but how often do you personally do this npm audit? Because I know for myself, to be honest, like I don't think I do it that often. I think
Mhm.
just, but maybe it's not a good thing, but how often do
Right.
you do it and how much do you even trust this audit?
So in terms of npm audit, I don't think we use npm audit in itself. Like it's there, which is kind of nice. In our case, there's like a company policy that mandates all projects integrating security scanning tools. So all of that stuff is usually part of the CI pipeline. And anytime, you run your CI pipeline, one stage is going to be static analysis, right? Um, like for instance, if you're running GitLab Enterprise, they have static analysis tooling already built in, or you can also defer to external vendors. Usually, there's like commercial SaaS solutions that allow you to send your code off to them, or at least send like your package specs so it knows all the versions of things you do. There's more sophisticated ones. I guess if you're using some common framework, I don't know how sophisticated it is for things like Node.js, but like I know for Java, it can analyze your code and try to see if there's any like sort of common vulnerabilities that you're accidentally may have introduced. So if you're working for a big organization, the organization should probably invest into that type of arrangement and just wire it up to your CI pipelines, have it running all the time. But again, uh, unfortunately, there's this idea between like risk reward type thing. I don't know if it's the right way to put it, but the breach is always possible, but it's always treated as like some contingency that's likely never going to happen up until it's too late. So people aren't really willing to put a lot of effort into that particular part until they get hacked. By the time it's obviously too late, right? So it's, I guess it really depends on the kind of industry you're working with. And if you are mandated because you're regulated, like, I don't know, if you're working with like personal information or if you're working with like health information, there are these government agencies that are going to be on you to, comply with all the different regulations. So you effectively are forced to do certain things. But if you're not in an industry like that and you're not forced to do anything, a lot of people tend to just ignore it entirely. Because again, I think before you get hacked, you probably need to be presenting yourself as like a juicy target. Because, if I write a tiny application with
Yeah.
3 users, nobody's going to bother hacking me on purpose. The other problem is if you're running any kind of server and you occasionally take a peek at the logs, you're going to see that you're constantly getting attacked through automatic means. Like you're constantly getting port scanned, your SSH server is constantly getting these really silly password attacks where they're just trying some user with like a dictionary of stupid passwords. I don't even know who does SSH passwords these days. I think everybody should just switch to like key-based authentication. But if you look at the logs, there's just constant onslaught, especially, there's many popular platforms that are notorious for being vulnerable. I guess like one of them, for instance, being WordPress. There's so many different plugins and so many different versions, and I don't entirely know their security model, but it's a very popular framework for deploying sites, and so it's being attacked all the time. So a lot of times you would see in your logs, they'll be trying to hit some WordPress plugin. You see in the URL be like WP/something something and some crafted payload that tries to, automatically pawn your server. And then once they do, the automatic ones, unlikely they're gonna go for your like the people's personal data. Maybe if it's WordPress, they can like dump the database of users, but whatever. Usually these types of attacks would install some sort of bot on your machine and join it into some CNC network, like the command and control. And then it's going to be either sending spam emails or trying to mine cryptocurrencies. But they'll basically hijack your resources and, force you to pay for your cloud provider some exorbitant amount of money without you noticing. So, if you're not going to get by a deliberate attack, you're also likely can get hit by an automated attack, which are happening 24/7.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. But you see, like this process with the scanning and with the npm. I remember one time there was a big news about like npm being vulnerable. I think it was like a library that um was hacked or like became
Mm-hmm.
like a doorway. I'm not too sure what that story was, but like, do you think if this happens like to libraries from npm itself, do you still think like the entire like process of using the same npm as a tool to scan to ensure security with the libraries is efficient? It's like using a robber to keep watch on a thief. I don't know if it makes sense. Like, they're the same
Right.
thing. It's just different words.
Right. I think we did cover it briefly when we were talking about the whole NPM premium in that episode, where
Yeah.
yeah, like some package maintainer access got compromised and somebody installed some sort of like code that would try to exfiltrate known crypto wallets from the system or whatever. And yeah, like automatic security scanning wouldn't necessarily detect stuff like that because again, it was a developer uploaded a new version of the library, right? So until like the way that audit works is it's basically just looking for if there has been any CVEs registered against that particular package version. And so if there wasn't any, then for a while it can do its job. And then when people notice, NPM can do a recall and, the CVE gets created and then automated tools start detecting it. But it is very reactive. And in general, the world of security is very reactive. And the difficulty with that is, the bad guys only need to win once in order to succeed, but you need to win always in order to succeed because one failure and that's it, game over, right? So it's very unforgiving and it's very difficult. And so I think when it comes to the question of, well, npm, some package got hacked, is it worth using npm? I think the answer to that is still yes, right? Because without npm, you could deploy applications, but the amount of effort required would be, considerably more.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
so the fact that people can enjoy all of these online services are like, greatly due to the fact that there's such a vibrant ecosystem where you literally pick a bunch of stuff off the shelf and, put it together and build a product off of
Mhm.
that. If you want to be a purist, or if you want to be slightly more paranoid than usual, you could try that. And I think some of the more sort of batteries included runtimes like Bun make it slightly easier because they just give you more. Or again, we talked about it before, you can use the vendoring approach and just don't update until, like, don't update automatically. I don't think it's realistic to do audit, because like if you go for libraries that don't have any dependencies of their own, you could potentially do audit. And even then, it's kind of gets tricky, because usually, you go on npm, there's a link to the package GitHub, and you go and look at the source code. But what's in npm, what the tarball with the actual library that you install when you run npm install, it's not the source code on GitHub. Like, it's something else. It's been built by when you run like your npm publish command, it actually prepares this tarball, and maybe there's a compilation step if it's written in TypeScript. Maybe there's like some minification. I don't know, whatever. So what's on GitHub isn't necessarily what's in the tarball, and they can publish malicious code as part of that and keep the source code pristine. And if you just take a cursory glance at the source code, you wouldn't necessarily see that, right? So, and if you kind of start unraveling that thread little by little, the whole idea of like trusted computing, it's like, well, there has been cases where you can have a malicious compiler that can take a reasonable source code, and during compilation can inject malicious code into it, right? So now you have to verify the custodial chain of your entire build process. Like, if you're starting to kind of get more and more paranoid, it basically boils down to, well, how do you know that there isn't something in the firmware of your CPU that's doing something malicious? Or because
No,
remember a couple of
at that point,
years,
you're
yeah,
not.
yeah, a couple of years ago, there were these like, oh, if you're buying from this one vendor outside of the United States, they found some chips on a motherboard that shouldn't be there, and they suspect that it has like some sort of malicious code that sends your data abroad. And there's like this big freak out. And in theory, technically, it is possible, though not to an extent that the media portrayed it, but it is possible, right? So you basically never know. You kind of have to stay sane, you just kind of have to have some sort of cutoff point and say, if we're getting attacked on a level that's beyond that, we're doomed. There's like nothing we can do. It's kind of the, am I being attacked by a Script-kiddie, or am I being attacked by a nation state security apparatus? Because one can run some scripts without even understanding what they do, and hope for one out of 100,000 machines that he scans will be vulnerable, and he'll pawn it and use it for something. The other one, you know they have billions of dollars in all technology in the world, and if they're intending on hacking you, you're gonna get hacked. So just like, not much you can do about that.
It's scary when you say that. Like, if they want to hack you, they will hack you. But that's actually scary because
Hmm.
in reality, you can try, but there's a lot of loopholes. And this is the question actually. Like,
Hmm.
when we are developing, there are some certain things, basic things that we can do on our side. Like you mentioned, like keeping your keys and like your um vital security tokens and all this security stuffs like in a separate file, secured somewhere, probably in one of this like vault, um like Bitwarden, if yeah, one of these things.
Right.
Uh, a vault, the vault is a good one too.
Hmm.
But the question I have now is like, aside from doing all of this, right? Do you have like a way to, like you mentioned, like for the Java one, like there are like some tools that you can use to actually scan your codes to ensure that um you are complying with the security policies. So now, are there like based on your experience, are there some like policies, really like written out policies that you need to follow in terms of like software development? So when it comes to like the basic level of it, like the entire OOP encapsulation, blah blah, the basic level of it, uh, are there some things that you need to keep in mind during this um coding process? You know,
Right.
like
Yeah. I think I
one
see
thing
what you mean. Yeah.
one one thing I would imagine is like you want to avoid data leak. You want to see, for example, like when you do um stuff in sometimes, let's say, to use an example, like let's say you're working with like Angular and then you forget to destroy the component, but particular the data from a component when you switch, blah blah blah, and then you still have this data like in the memory and it's still accessible even though you're no longer there, blah blah blah, stuff like
Hmm.
this. And all these processes, like I know, but do you have more of this type of things that you do on a daily basis during at work to make sure that your the work you're doing complies with like security policies?
Well, I guess the first thing you kind of have to have is the security policies. And there's this term, the security theater, that there are all of these policies and motions that people go through to make an appearance of something being secure, but in fact it's not it's secure to a casual observer because they don't know any better, but a person who understands how these things work knows how to navigate in these types of environments. And I think the biggest contributor to the security of the applications that you build is still actually having developers understand how to write secure code. Because okay, like we do a security audit for the applications that we build professionally, right? A company comes in and they do a security audit, and at the end they give you this document that lists all of the different things and like the severity levels and this and that. And several times I've been reading these reports on these security audits, and I'm like, this is very perfunctory. Like, sure, they ran NPM audit and put the output of it in their security report saying, oh, we've identified all of these vulnerabilities in your code, without actually understanding that some of those vulnerabilities never leave the developer's own machine, even, let alone the server and where the application is hosted. So if they see those as problematic, where I'm a developer and on my company provided laptop, let's say even in the office, with all of the firewalls and everything that the company has, and all of the software, the security software that usually they install on the laptop itself, you're saying that this is a critical problem, right? If you're saying that, that means you don't necessarily understand the nature of the vulnerability in this particular library. And if you don't understand the nature of vulnerability in this library that never leaves my development machine, it kind of gives me doubts about your sort of professional capacity overall, right? Because like, yeah, on paper, like, yeah, we have this report, but in practical terms, like, that's not very high quality data that you're giving me back as feedback, right? And I've encountered it a bunch of times. And companies pay thousands of dollars for security audits. I'm probably again gonna offend some people that might be listening. But yeah, companies pay a lot of money for these security audits, and they have a report at the end of the day, and they have suggested mitigations, and then company does the mitigations, and then everybody is just happy, and it's like, okay, we ticked all the boxes, we can feel good about ourselves. Did that actually improve the security of application? Maybe. But bureaucratically, there's a sign off on a compliance report from the security auditor. Everybody's ass is covered. In case anything happened, they can say, well, see, hey, we have this report here that said we mitigated all of the things. Yet, you still get hacked somehow. So it is very reactive, and a lot of it is kind of feel good. And a lot of complaints that I heard from security professionals in the industry is that nobody ever wants to spend any money on security until it's too late, and then they're willing to spend as much as necessary to kind of bring people back. Like because okay, like security, like data leaks are only one side, right? You can be suffering from denial of service, where customers can't reach your site, which means you need to involve like network people and do mitigations and like do all of these things, and it's just like brute force. Somebody's just hammering your servers, or you can get injected with a crypto ransom malware that just encrypts everyone's hard drive and demands money to decrypt it back, right? Which paralyzes the entire organization. Like there's so many different vectors of attack, and I think if you look at some of the old sort of like big hacker personalities from like the 90s, Kevin Mitnick, for instance, rest in peace, I believe he passed away recently. He was like considered to be the first modern hacker, in a sense, very highly publicized by the media. Most of his work he did through social engineering. It wasn't even necessarily through code. He would get people to do what he wanted and exfiltrate the data that he needed without running a single piece of code. He would just call people, pretend to be somebody else, schmooze and charm, and he got what he needed, right? So code is like a portion of this entire equation, right? But people is usually much easier to kind of exploit. Yeah. And that's why, again, a lot of these companies, they do these simulated phishing attacks to find people who respond to these types of things, where, you get some email that it's like, oh, please, somebody tried logging into your Office 365. Click here to reset your password type deal. But if you click on it, it's actually a training exercise. And if you click on it, it's like, well, you've been scheduled for mandatory security training next week, right? which is fair enough, because, not many people it's very difficult to identify these things. I know I'm kind of sort of jumping from one thing to the other, but like the phishing attacks are pretty interesting, especially these days, because ever since they allowed Unicode to register domain names, it all kind of went to shit, because there's like so many characters that are visually similar but not the same. So like maybe you have like a lowercase letter I from, I don't know, Turkish alphabet that looks same as like the English lowercase letter I, but it's a different code point, so it's a different domain, and you have like Microsoft.com with that weird letter in it, and it looks legit, but it's not, and it becomes progressively more and more difficult to detect these things, and so phishing attacks are really, really, really successful for some people, because they just like click on links in their emails. So where was I going with this? Well, yeah, like the overall thing is that, yeah, security is usually an afterthought. And unless you have security conscious people on a team that understand, maybe they don't have to be security experts, because the field is massive and there's all sorts of different things, but you just have to have an appreciation for it, and kind of having nose for weird smells. Like, why are we doing it like this? This can have potentially implications, right? So, because you can have all the policies you want, and people can go through the motions of doing the checklists, and then on paper everything appears to be fine, but it doesn't necessarily mean that.
But I imagine that there should be a way for us to measure how secure a software is exactly. So for example, um, I wish there would be a way to to do like let's say every time you build a new feature, you have a way to measure how secure your development process is.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I don't know a lot about these policies, but I know about like the governing bodies, you know, like the when it comes to the ISOs and like those
Yeah, yeah.
those parts. I know a little bit about this part, but that's mostly just for like regulations. And when it comes to security itself, I think it's the responsibility of the the company or like the developers or like the people responsible for the software. But I'm you mentioned earlier like um when you were talking about the conference, I think you mentioned how important it is for software developers to also get some education in security. And it got me thinking about like if as a software developer you want to actually know about this type of things, but you don't really know where to start from, like what type of education do you think you can seek out for? Because
Right.
security is a very big domain. You can get lost into it.
Yeah.
Like we were just talking about the hacking part, and that's a different ball game entirely when it comes to security. There's many sides to it. Like the data leak is also another thing because people might not even be trying to um hurt you. It's just out of your own carelessness, you let a lot of people's information go um become available to people who should not have it. But these are things that we can point at, like these are things that we can point at as um, experiences, like things that has happened that we've seen. But what I'm really curious about is where to find the education to, because for me, if I remember very well, like even in the uni or like during my masters, I don't think like this was it was treated differently. There were like some people who this is their specialty, that they spend their years studying about software security and like cyber security, whatever security they do. But as software engineers, really, this is not something that they preach a lot to us. So we just build, but it's up to us to know what is good and what is bad. So we learn about like the development processes, but we don't really have a lot of, maybe I should speak for myself or speak from here. We don't really have a lot of knowledge, or like we weren't given a lot of knowledge about like this is the secured way to do this, or like
Right.
this is the secure. We just know
Yeah.
like the basic principles. Like
Mm-hmm.
everybody knows, don't put your your database password in your
Yeah.
in your class method, you know,
Yeah.
like in your,
Exactly.
you know,
Exactly. Well,
this basic ones.
arguably, there you have to also understand that there is a compromise between security and usability. And like I don't necessarily mean usability in terms of like UX, but more in terms of actually being able to use it. Because, the most secure
Yeah.
server is the one that's sitting in a safe, powered down, and disconnected from any kind of network. Very secure. Nobody's going to hack into that, right? Is it usable? No. So you have to have some compromise between usability and security. And usually, the more secure something is, the less usable it becomes. Like, for instance, I am using Bitwarden as my password manager, right? And recently, they told me that it's using like some key derivation function that has a lot of iterations to slow down brute force attempts. And they said, oh, with the advancements in computing, the amount of iterations you have on yours is low, so you should increase it. And I'm like, okay, I'll increase it. But now every time I try to unlock my vault on my phone, it takes like 5 seconds because it has to crunch through all of the iterations to
Mm.
unlock my vault, right? So by increasing my security, I decrease my usability. And that happens basically with a lot of these things, right? And a lot of times, yeah, I think like security, as you mentioned, security is an afterthought. And because a lot of times, especially now, we very often follow like the happy path development, where we just do the thing that leads us to the good outcome and stop there, right? Maybe if people who are using like TDD or something, they write some occasional test for all of the bad possibilities, just because their quality gate says, oh, your branch coverage metric is low, so you need to handle those else conditions when things don't go as planned, right? And they don't teach it in a uni because, again, it's hard and there's different classes. Like back in the day, a lot of vulnerabilities in software were, oh, it's exploitable because somebody's not checking their arrays and like some pointer points to the memory that they don't control, right? But
Mm-hmm.
it has been evolving massively. Like if you ever look at any of the videos that have to do with console hacking, it's fascinating, because people who make consoles, like gaming consoles like a Nintendo or
Mm-hmm.
Xbox, they usually don't want people to be able to play pirated games on them because they sell these consoles at a loss and they recoup that money through the sale of authentic DVDs with games. So they really don't want people to be able to run arbitrary code on their consoles, not because the console is something so secure because of all of these reasons, because it has all of this information that can. It's like, no, they just don't want you to run pirated games. And in a way, a lot of like Xbox console is probably more secure compared to your Windows laptop, right? It's like a very locked down environment. You can't really do that much on it that is not authorized explicitly. And it's really hard for people these days to find exploits that allow them to like break out of the security system. But at the same time, it can run those games and it can't run anything else. So again, because you only use it to play games, that's perfectly fine. But if you can't necessarily use it as a general purpose computing device because it's heavily locked down, right? But if you look at the history of how these security measures were circumvented, you learn a lot about the creativity of people trying to circumvent that. I think a lot of coders in the security space come out of like a where is scene where people like crack software, crack copy protection, and like crack consoles. And they operate in the domain of, buffer overflows and ROP gadgets and like hardware stuff and like fuzzing and undervolting things to kind of, because like right now, a lot of these things are starting to get baked into our hardware and into our operating systems. So the whole class of vulnerabilities that were exploitable 20 years ago are just not possible on modern hardware and on modern software. Which means there's this constant amping up of, you know, how to put it, like the potential on both sides, the potential on the side of guys who are trying to break into stuff, and the response on the side of guys who try to defend from it. It constantly
Ah,
gets more and
okay.
more sophisticated, right? Again, we talked about it. I don't remember what it was referring to, but I mentioned this whole like bullet versus armor thing. They get more
Sure.
sophisticated, that side gets more sophisticated, and it just keeps on going, right? And so I think maybe the future for that, like for instance, we can take a look between like a differences between Node.js and Deno, like Deno being this other runtime, and Deno follows more of a capabilities model, Maybe I'm not phrasing it correctly because capabilities model has a very specific connotations to it. But like with Deno, you have to explicitly request permissions to do certain things. Like if your library, like by default, you get nothing. Like you can write some code, but like if you want to touch file system, for instance, you have to explicitly run your program and say, I allow file system access to this folder, or I allow access to network. It's like how on Android phones and on iPhones these days, like back in the day, if you remember on Android, when you installed the program from Play Store, it would say, oh, this program requires this permission, that permission, like a whole bunch of permissions, and then you click OK, right? And then it installs. And later on,
Yeah.
there was some malicious application, which was like a flashlight application that turns on the LED on your phone. But for some reason, it asks for like all possible permissions on a platform. And because people don't know any better, they see a pop-up, they don't read it, they press OK. Now the app has access to their contacts, to their location, to like photographs, files, everything, right? And it was just siphoning that data out. So eventually they switched, and now whenever an application tries to gain access to some protected resource, you get that pop-up saying, like, not when you install it, but when it's actually trying to access it. So right now, if I open my flashlight app and it says, oh, I want to get access to your pictures, I'd be like, why do you need that? Right? So like, not that's again trying to balance out between security and usability, right? Because a person who understands security would look at that list of permissions and say, hell no. But most people don't think that way, right? They don't have to think that way. They haven't been habituated to think that way. And that part was abused. So the fact that that phone, that flashlight app was able to steal so many people's data, it wasn't particularly technically sophisticated thing. It was mostly using the fact that most people don't read anything on pop-ups and blindly click OK. So it was a form of social engineering in a sense, where the app socially engineered you by saying a bunch of security-related gobbledygook, and you're like, oh, I don't care, I just press OK, right? So it's just preying on human psychology. So maybe something like capabilities model where you explicitly allow things and you prohibit everything else. But that makes it more difficult, right? Because you have to think about these things sort of from the initial moment, right? It's not something you can trivially bolt on top. And because we want to give people less friction when developing, it's just like, yeah, you can use whatever you want, right? If you run Node, you get access to everything, right? And other funny thing that's happening too is applications, there's like privileged ports. So any TCP port below 1024 is considered privileged by the operating system, and if you try to use them, you need elevated permissions to do that. And majority of well-known ports like HTTP, HTTPS, email, they're all in that range. So usually, like if you want to run a web server, you need a privileged port, like port 80 or port 443. Like it has to be a privileged process to be able to bind to that port. So somebody may be like, oh, I want to run my Node application on port 80, but the system doesn't let me, so I'll just sudo it, and then boom, you have a Node application executing as root, and now it has access to everything, right? So it's just people
There is
don't
that.
necessarily think
There
about
is
things
that.
like that.
There
Yeah.
is that. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Absolutely. Like, yeah, totally. You're right. That's one thing. Like, running your applications and on root, I don't think it's a good idea. But these are things, somehow I feel like the best teacher in our jobs is your experience, like your own personal mess up. But uh, it's a very risky thing to do too. It's like, it's maybe, if I'm not being exaggerating a lot, I think it's just as risky as a doctor's mess up, because in the hospital, if you make a mistake, someone died, likely.
Yeah.
But for us, it's like a lot of things can happen.
Hmm.
That might not even be the end of the end of everything that can happen, because if you this type of mistake can just like leak a lot of things. You can lose a lot of things just from this type of mistake. But these are the kind of things that I was really hoping to learn about, because like there are little things, like for example the root thing, also like taking time to make sure like all your information are in the right places, also taking time to do like the scannings and like getting information, like learning about how all these things work. These are really good information, but um I also have like other aspects of it that I'm curious about. Say, for example, in a team, right? Like when you develop, like if you work by yourself, like you build your own applications, you're responsible for the security on your own. But if you work, let's say you work in a company, like there is different teams responsible for certain things. I don't know how it works on your side, but in my experience so far, like in the different teams I've worked on, I don't know if it's like usually the responsibility of the developers to really like look into like the security, or is this like a DevOps sense, or like security in different layers? Because there is security in development process, in the development phase, which is what we're talking about now. But which one has more emphasis and which one carries the most risk?
You know what I'm gonna say? Again, this is likely gonna upset a lot of people, but if, God forbid, anything happens and there's a leak or something like that, you have to remember that inherently people are gonna be trying to, do things in their own interest and to their advantage. And so the blame game inevitably starts, right? And the finger pointing starts. Oh, DevOps was supposed to do that. Oh, developers didn't
Yeah.
do that. Oh, the network guys didn't do that. So as much as it's the time for everybody to kind of have a unified front and figure it out and try to save it, it's going to be, he did this versus he did that. So like, and they'll find some scapegoat, and that person, will be blamed for all of the problems, even though, you could have been telling everybody that there's risks and yada yada. And the response would usually be, oh, we don't have a budget for it, blah blah blah, we'll do it next quarter, blah blah blah. So it's sort of this unfortunate reality where uh, someone will end up being responsible, even though, again, because of how complex these things are these days, I don't think it's ever like one person's fault, unless it's very, very obvious that, somebody committed some code that opens the system wide open. But, it could be like a perfect storm of various configurations at different levels that opened up some way in, and it's not like any single one person responsible. It's really hard to analyze too, these types of things, right? Because again, we've discussed it recently. I went to that security meetup before flying to Fort St. John, and the organization, in case of an attack, again, they want to be operational as soon as possible. And a lot of times they don't even leave enough time to physically isolate compromised machines and snapshot them and freeze them so that people can actually do postmortem analysis and try to understand how it happened, why it happened. It's like, we don't care, our site must be operational, and that machine, gets reformatted, or the pod in Kubernetes gets destroyed, or cluster gets rebooted, and you lose all evidence of how it happened, right? So in terms of who's responsible, I think kind of, I really dislike the concept of like shared accountability, because if everybody's responsible for something, then nobody really is responsible for anything. Everybody can always say, oh, there was some other guy, it wasn't up to me. At the same time, if you designate yourself as a security champion, then you're like the first target to be blamed for things. So that's not ideal either, right? But again,
Mhm.
somebody needs to fulfill that role. And I think most places don't really, like, they don't really do that. Most companies that I worked for, they would have security, like they would have like a chief security officer, and that person usually is very well versed in the domain, and they attempt to protect the organization more on like the network level. They don't really go on like application level. They don't teach developers on what to do and what not to do. It's mostly about, you know, firewalls, detection, a little bit on mitigation, because it is impossible to review all of the code that an organization produces. It's just, there's no way, you know, if you want to be able to be on market at the right time, there's just like, it's not happening. As much,
Yeah,
like, if I put on my security hat, as much as I'd like for it to be that way, it's not going to happen for commercial reasons and financial reasons. It's just, there's no way. It's basically like, we'll wing it, and we'll think about something sometime later. We'll put some protections on it and things like that, and then everybody just sort of prays that they don't get hacked, right? I mean, you can obviously do things to reduce the chances of that happening, but you have to be kind of very proactive about it. Like, oh, you know, if we have a customer database, maybe we have to encrypt all of the data in it right away. And I mean, like, okay, I'm not gonna say that nobody's not doing anything. Like, even in our organization, you know, the production database, you don't even get the read access. Or even when you do get read access, you don't even see certain columns in tables because they're column-based security. Like, you don't get to see that, right? Like, the application itself gets access to those, but if you just connect to the database through the console, you don't see them,
yeah,
right? So there's obviously mitigations in place, and you kind of have to be cautious about it. But for some of the bugs that are less obvious, like this header smuggling thing, really hard to detect, you know, even though there's like automated tools to do that. The problem with automated tools, the other problem with automated tools is eventually it becomes known what they're looking for, and then the attacker can adapt and try the things that they're not looking for, right? To find something that they're not looking for, because again, it turns into this, you know, security checklist. Everything's been ticked off. We're good. It's like, no, you're not. You're just good against those things, but for all of the part of the iceberg that is underwater that you're not looking for, you're probably not good, right? So I don't know. It's a very fatalistic area of computing in
yeah.
general. It's just, you know.
You know, uh, I agree with you, like it's very complex, but also there seems to be like a layer on it. I think what I'm about to say kind of like agrees with what you said earlier, that it's difficult to actually like check on the application level. And maybe this is the reason why the developers don't really get the the information or the knowledge being shared with them about like, oh, these are the things that you should do, the security policies and all this thing. But I think that's probably because most applications nowadays are also like wrapped up in some cloud technology somewhere, and that's considered security to some level.
Mhm.
And hence the reason why it is the responsibility of certain departments, because um when it comes to like the cloud part of like the application, I'm not too sure like if a lot of the developers have access to all this part. You
Mhm.
you ship your code and then you forget about what you did. But when it comes to like the this part, this pipeline part, like this the one that goes to the cloud, um I don't know if we but if they have like a lot of access to it. But I think it might also be a good thing security wise, because I know I know how we think, how we work sometimes, and maybe we take a lot of risks, a lot of things have
Mm.
been moved along pretty quickly. Maybe it's also not a maybe it's also not a good thing to
Yeah.
give access to everyone to be able to do this type of thing. But
Yeah.
what I want to learn about is these policies, you know. We speak a lot about policies, we speak a lot about like checklists, but I would like for whoever will be listening to this and has the opportunity to do something different in their own team, or like to it would be really nice to give everybody the information that they need, not just like information about like phishing phishing attacks, which is relevant, but
Hmm.
when it comes to the application itself, I think the knowledge about security should be shared across everyone. I don't think it's something that it should be for a certain type of a certain department, like, or just DevOps, or like um
Yeah.
network guys, or like, but
I,
I
I
think
yeah.
everyone should have this information.
I broadly agree. I think that there should be, in order to like avoid the bystander problem, there should be somebody maybe self-designating to be the security champion and kind of be the go-to person. And maybe they don't necessarily have answers for everything, but they can be the bridge, right? So
Yeah, absolutely.
in terms of practical answers, go to OWASP, OWSP or OWASP. That's the
Yeah,
repository
OWASP.
of all the common vulnerabilities in the wild that have been encountered, and just go over it and be like, what is out there? What should I be on the lookout for? The other thing too is find a local security scene and go and hang out and just talk to people. Because again, in my personal experience, these two worlds don't collide nearly enough, which to me is strange. And again, overall, I think everybody's playing the chance game, right? It's like there's so many targets out there. A lot of these attacks are opportunistic. I mean, it's a very different thing to be a victim of a targeted attack versus being a victim of opportunistic attack, right? And by doing maybe not the bare minimum, but by doing some steps, you can drastically reduce your chances of being a victim of opportunistic attack. It's like the person who puts a floodlight in front of their garage tells the potential thief, it's like, it's gonna be much harder to pull it off here, so buddy, go look elsewhere. Go look for
Mm-hmm.
somebody who's less security conscious and leave me alone. Which is ruthless, but that's the world. No, can't really do much about that, right? If you're a victim of a targeted attack, that is a completely different story. And the security needs to be layered, and you need monitoring and early warnings, and intrusion detection and anomaly detection. And there's a lot of companies that specialize in selling you the peace of mind, right? Which is like this checklist approach. Oh, install
Mm-hmm.
our intrusion detection system, you get the cool dashboard, and then again, it ticks that box, like, we have an intrusion detection system. Is it going to detect a particular intrusion that's about to happen 6 months from now? Maybe, maybe not, right? Again, the reason why it's so difficult is because you have to succeed 100% of the time, and they only have to succeed once, right? So you have to be prepared. You have to be prepared for the consequences. You have to minimize the attack surface. You have to minimize the exposure surface. Like, essentially, it's like operating a spy cell. Everything needs to be compartmentalized, and people like have access to things on a need to know basis. You don't just give access to everybody, because one person gets compromised, the whole thing gets compromised. The problem with that is, again, that introduces friction, and that introduces usability problems. And so you can be more secure, but then everybody's going to be, suffering under the horrible bureaucracy and red tape and having to go through 57 different checklists to get access to some system next door, right? Which again, it's not great because it slows you down quite a lot. So it's the constant battle. What do you pick? I think in the beginning, when, like, let's say for a startup, broadly speaking, when you're a nobody, you don't need all that. You have to be as fast as you can in iterating and delivering. But once you secure some sort of spot for yourself in the market, you have to pivot and you have to pay more attention to that. Unfortunately, though, architecturally, a lot of applications are not prepared for that pivot necessarily because they've been built not sloppily, but just with the assumption of, everything's permitted type deal, right? So again, it's life, You can't envision a perfect solution that will get you from the beginning to end, with all of these considerations in mind. It's a dance. You constantly have to adapt and change.
You mentioned architecture now, and then something came to mind because these days I'm taking some courses to refresh my mind about like software architecture and the entire process of it. But I just got curious now. At what point do you actually start considering security when you are doing the architecture, like in the planning phase, like the architecture phase of development?
I think you kind of have to introduce it. Like, okay, so again, the sooner you introduce it, the better it is going to be for your security posture, but the more friction it's going to create because, when you have your passwords on people's development machines, they can just go and do stuff. But now, if you start introducing secret manager, now you kind of have to configure everybody, proper access. Like a lot of these things require this speed bump that you kind of have to get over before it stops being a problem. And some of these speed bumps require refactoring, which again, not many companies give a lot of time for refactoring. So I would say you just have to be conscious of it the entire time. It's just usually for speed, that thing gets sacrificed. One of the first things that's going to get sacrificed, right? Which is again,
Speed, right?
like speed to market, like the pace of delivery. The faster
Okay.
you want to deliver, the more you have to cut, and security is complicated enough and introduces that much more friction that usually it's like, okay, we can do that later. It's always we can do that later. And for some people, the later never comes, and maybe they never get hacked, and it's fine. But some people do get hacked, and then they would say, oh, we had all of these opportunities to do that and we didn't.
Yeah. I have a question. It's relatively I mean, they say there is no stupid question, right? I really hope that but this question is actually on my mind right now. I'm just thinking about the entire cloud architecture, right? And I'm wondering, like, the entire purpose of this is actually for security, as well as other things.
As well
Like,
as, yeah.
as well as other things.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm trying to justify like the reason why we don't hear a lot of things about security in like the development room. Like nobody is asking you, like the only thing we don't do is just make sure you keep the keys where the keys should be. That's the 101,
Mm-hmm.
So like I'm thinking like is the reason because we have so much faith in like the cloud technologies, like, oh, it's not. It's like
I think
you can't really break into them, right? Like they expect them to be safe and tight.
I think that's the idea, is that if you're hosted on AWS, and somebody wants to attack you, they're not attacking you, they have to attack AWS in a sense, right?
Exactly.
So
Yeah.
obviously there are some ways that they can attack you because you still expose your application to the outside world, right? But in terms of somebody actually, going to the data center and like yanking the server out of the rack, like that's not really a possibility anymore for these types of things. And I think people do
Yeah.
get some degree of sense of security from that alone, right? It's like, oh, okay, Amazon knows what they're doing and nobody's getting into their data center. And, we have all of this isolation
Mhm.
and, the cloud infrastructure takes care of a lot of these things for us. However, I have to say that AWS configuration, I'm not an expert in it. I kind of understand broadly how it works, but not to any sort of very focused degree. But the configuration for those things is quite arcane, and you can easily slip up and forget to do something, right? And recently, I remember in our conversation about AI, I was actually talking to people about it during that security meetup, and most LLMs, when asked about configuration for cloud for various applications, produced configurations that were like vulnerable to 98% of known things. So if you just ask ChatGPT, it's like, hey, I need to deploy this to Kubernetes or whatever, or AWS, give me some Helm charts and give me some Terraform configs, it would spit something at you that's insecure by default. So
I mean,
you gotta beware of that. Yeah.
yeah.
And the thing is too is, again, because you have to do everything right and there's so many things to do right, you miss one thing and that drastically reduces your chances. For example, recently, um, a popular communication server in Russia was apparently targeted by a state-sponsored attacker, where they were being hosted on a German hosting provider on a like a VPS. So it wasn't like a cloud, but it was a virtual machine running in a data center. Um, it wasn't like Amazon type stuff or anything like that. And basically, what happened was the traffic to one of those machines got briefly interrupted. And during that window, they requested for a Let's Encrypt certificate for their domain, and then installed a man-in-the-middle attack for those particular servers, and then plugged in the traffic back together. So the overall downtime was like 19 seconds or something like that. And then whenever people would connect to that messaging platform, they would get connected to the machine that's now is able to monitor traffic, and then that traffic would get sent to the original machine, and nobody really knew, up until at some point in time one of the developers, I believe, tried to connect to the machine directly, and he got an error saying that the certificate is invalid. Like the certificate, or sorry, no,
Mm-hmm.
the, the
Mm-hmm.
the certificate, because Let's Encrypt only issues certificates for 3 months. The certificate
Yeah.
issued for the man-in-the-middle machine expired. And when somebody
Yeah.
connected to it, it said the certificate has expired. And he said, that's interesting. Why did it expire? We recently rotated. And then they looked at the fingerprint. So could they do something about it? Yes. As a matter of fact, you can publish CCA records in your DNS saying that if you're like, this domain can only request from Let's Encrypt, and when it requests from Let's Encrypt, it has to have this user ID.
Mm.
They didn't do that, and somebody was able to issue a certificate on their behalf through DNS-based validation. And it's like, I mean, I have CCA records on my domains, but they don't have my user ID in them. So somebody can technically still request certificates from Let's Encrypt without my user ID and issue certificates for my domain. So I'm vulnerable to that. And I'm just one guy,
Finally. Finally. Like, it's these things are really, really like deep. It's deep. But I'm really glad we got to talk about it because I feel like it has helped me even to realize a lot of things about the security aspect of development. Like it's I still wonder why we don't get to talk more about it, like in the teams actually.
Yeah.
Like I feel like everyone should get at least good knowledge of what it means to build secure application, what it means to deploy secure like to deploy secure applications,
Hmm.
or like um yeah, if
Yeah.
my English is actually correct. Yeah,
I
but you
yeah.
get what I'm saying.
I get what you're trying to say. I think
Yeah.
it's just a very scary kind of area, and once you start looking into everything that's happening in this area, you get
Mhm.
legitimately freaked out, and not many people like that feeling. And we talked a little bit about like application security, we talked a little bit about network security, we talked a little about social
Yeah.
engineering, but once you start looking at, oh, majority of IoT devices are vulnerable to all sorts of stuff and they never get patched, and people install all these smart devices in their houses on their own local Wi-Fi networks and
Yeah.
things like that. Once you start thinking about these things, you just go like, oh my god, like this,
Yeah.
we're
Yeah.
we're
True.
doomed. We're doomed.
Yeah. True.
That's why
Absolutely.
there's no smart devices on my local network. It's just not an option.
Yeah, but you have a phone, Vasily.
I have a
You have
phone. I have a phone, and my phone is the bane of my existence. And I'll probably go back to a Nokia 3310
you have
once
a
this one
phone, you
dies.
have a computer, like there is no hiding from distance. Like
It is true. So one of the things that I should mention too is operational security is extremely difficult. It takes one slip up and you're done. But still, use a password manager. Do not reuse passwords on websites. Preferably, do not reuse emails when you register on websites. Most email providers allow you to do like the plus address trick to have multiple email addresses for different places. And the problem is, again, it makes life more difficult, and people don't like to make their own life more difficult. The problem, I think, is that they don't really understand the depth and breadth of consequences when data gets leaked. I don't know about Canada, but in America, people relay all sorts of horror stories about somebody 5 states over opening lines of credit in their name because their social security number got leaked or something like that. So, you know,
um
put a lock on your credit score, and don't reuse your passwords, and
yeah,
change all of your passwords, rotate
yeah,
them. Like,
absolutely.
I don't know any of my passwords pretty much. I have like several hundreds of passwords in my password manager. I don't know any of them except for the master one that is long and complicated, and it's pain in the ass to type it in every time, but I type it in every time. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, I mean it's been a really very informative session. Like learning about all these things is really good. I feel like I'm probably gonna be passing this information to some of my team members, like the at least like the ones that are close to me, because I think we should all learn some things about this type of things, and it helps us to be better engineers as well, and the best helps us to make like more
I'll
better decisions.
yeah, I'll reach out to my friend in a security company and see if he wants to do a
Yeah,
collab.
let's do it.
Cause
Let's do it. Like
yeah, because
this
then
is
he,
worth
he's
talking
like an
about.
actual security professional, and it's not just me being on the periphery of it and just being broadly interested in like console hacking and social engineering. And oh,
Yeah.
we haven't even covered the whole aspect of like penetration testing and physical
Oh,
security.
there is that too. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. You know, fun fact, I used to do like a little bit of like pen testing, like way, long way back. It was fun, but yeah, I can see how that's another entire domain itself. Like,
man, I think red
yeah.
teaming is probably very fun and very exhilarating, but I think you kind of have to have a certain kind of personality to do it. But yeah,
Like,
On YouTube, search for a guy called Deviant Ollam. He's like a security guy that specializes in like penetration testing and physical penetration, like actually entering people's secure
yeah,
locations. It's a lot of fun. He's a very cool guy. Yeah.
yeah. Things like this are actually fun, but if you're on the receiving side of it, it's not really fun. It
But
will be.
you know, it's kind of interesting. Like I watched a bunch of his videos on that, and I would be like walking around when I was still at the office. I was like, "Oh, this door is vulnerable to this attack," and like that thing is like,
Yeah,
you start noticing these things, right? And yeah, I think in the remote world is different, but
yeah, yeah.
it's still pertinent because not every. I think software is remote, but most the thing is with security, most things are not even have to do with software for most part, right? It's like getting in or getting to know somebody, or social engineering and all of that. So, but yeah,
It works in different ways now. Social engineering, to speak a little bit about it, it is even worse now because, like, now with the social, one time I saw someone tweet something about, like, oh, if you have a certain number in your bank account, you should write it out, you know, or like write your full name and some people they do like these giveaways and like they say like, right. So imagine you have all this like information about yourself
yeah.
somewhere on the internet, like how
That's why
vulnerable
you
you made
should
yourself.
yeah, you should pick really weird security questions. If you have like a free form security question, pick like
Yeah.
something really weird, because if somebody ever asks you that question, you'd be like, aha, he's trying to
Yeah.
get access to my account, right? It's not random,
Yeah.
because like random person would not ask that, right?
True. Like,
And
you
the other
never
the other
know.
thing too, in terms of personal security, there's like a lot of scamming going on. I mean, a lot of people are probably aware of like fake tech support scams and refund scams, but
Yeah,
now
this is
there's this
common.
whole new class of scams called the pig butchering scams, where somebody contacts you on your phone or Instagram or Facebook out of the blue. Some attractive girl is gonna send you a message, and you're gonna reply and say, "Hey, wrong person," and she'll be like, "Oh, sorry, but by the way,
Oh
blah blah
yeah.
blah blah," and then they'll like drag it out for months, establishing a rapport with you, and it will be very kind of non-committal or whatever.
Mhm.
But the goal eventually is to get you to part with your money, because after a couple of months of communication, you think, "Oh, this person's legit." Nope, it's a call center somewhere in China trying to. And these days they also use like AI generated photographs or even videos. So if you ask them to like
Absolutely.
prove their authenticity through a video, they can quickly whip one up, and it's really scary.
Absolutely.
It's really scary out there.
Absolutely. Like, this is pretty common. Like, in fact, aside from this, I also know about the type of fraud like you do, like with on dating sites.
Hmm.
Some
Hmm.
people they create like profiles, like, and then you talk to them for months, several. I mean, I think it's a long haul to go
Yeah.
into all these different
And
types
then
of
they're like,
to,
"Oh, I
to,
really love to meet you, but I don't have enough money for airplane. Send me five thousand
you get it.
dollars." Yeah, yeah. No,
Yeah,
I
yeah,
mean, I
yeah.
never participated in these types of things, but
Yeah,
clearly, yeah,
it's
yeah.
a really deep hole. Like, but anyway,
So yeah,
yeah. Thank you, Vasily.
yeah.
It's really nice talking about this type of things. Thank you for sharing your knowledge.
Sure
Uh,
thing,
it's
sure thing.
really
And
nice
yeah,
to learn.
if you want to be secure, you need to turn Amish and just abandon all technology, and then you have better chances.
We can't. It's not possible, Vasily.
But you'll
It's
have to.
not possible. But it's not
Yes.
even possible. Sometimes I'm afraid, like, with like the entire smart gadgets that we have now, TVs, all these things that we have. You never know. You never
Yes.
know. Like, but it is what it is.
It is what it is. But one thing that I should mention before we finish this is that pay extremely close attention to your children's communications habits online, because they're way more vulnerable to this stuff compared to most adults. I mean, most adults are very vulnerable to that, but children even more so. So don't let your kids go on the internet, basically. They, you know, not
Yeah,
worth in so many ways, and this one as one of them.
yeah, absolutely. I agree with you. I agree with you. I hope someone hears this and it's useful for them.
I hope so too. Thanks you everybody for being with us. And yeah, if you have any thoughts on this, feel free to leave a comment down below or join the Telegram and we can chat with you there. And we'll see you in the next one. Bye.
Bye.